The first thing Hayes noticed was that her son had stopped calling her Mom. For the past 3 weeks, Daniel had been unusually careful with every word, constantly telling her she needed to slow down, let the family handle things, and stop worrying about the house. That morning, 2 strangers were carrying her suitcase toward the front door while Daniel stood behind them with his arms folded. "You'll be safer there," he said. Margaret looked at the suitcase, then at her daughter Rebecca. "Safer where?" Rebecca forced a smile. "At the nursing home. Mom, just until we figure things out." Margaret stared at them. She was 67, widowed for 2 years, and still perfectly capable of cooking, paying her bills, shopping, and managing her own home. She knew she wasn't as quick as she had been before Robert died, but she wasn't helpless. "What exactly are you trying to figure out?" she asked. Neither answered. Daniel finally said, "The house, the bills, everything. You don't have to worry anymore." Margaret's eyes narrowed. "The house?" Daniel hesitated, and Rebecca immediately interrupted. "He just means we'll take care of everything while you're away." Margaret said nothing. Instead, she watched Daniel's hand. He was holding a thick folder, and sticking out from it was a business card. Margaret recognized the logo immediately. It belonged to a real estate company. "Why do you have a realtor's card?" she asked. Daniel froze for half a second. "It's nothing." Rebecca stepped closer. "Mom, please. You're making this harder than it needs to be." Margaret looked around the home she and Robert had shared for 42 years. The photographs, the old piano, Robert's chair. Beside the window, everything was still, exactly where she had left it. Yet something had changed. Her children weren't simply trying to protect her. They were desperate to get her out of the house. As the strangers carried her suitcase through the front door, Margaret watched Daniel quietly slip the realtor's card back into his folder. She said nothing, but one question had already taken root in her mind. Why did her children already have a realtor? Margaret barely slept that night. The nursing home room was clean and quiet, but every sound felt unfamiliar, and she couldn't stop thinking about the folder in Daniel's hand. A realtor's card. Why would her son have that? The next morning, she called Rebecca. "Can you bring me the rest of my things?" "Of course, Mom." Margaret paused. "And my old filing cabinet." There was silence on the other end. "Why?" "I need some papers." Another pause followed before Rebecca finally said, "I'll see what I can find." Margaret recognized the hesitation in her daughter's voice. 2 hours later, Rebecca arrived with a small box containing clothes and toiletries. But there was no filing cabinet. Margaret looked at the box, then at her daughter. "Where's my cabinet?" Rebecca sighed. "We couldn't move everything. Why not?" "Mom, you're staying here. You don't need all that paperwork." Margaret stared at her. "I didn't ask what I need." Rebecca looked away. Margaret decided not to argue. Instead, she asked casually, "Has anyone been inside the house?" Rebecca's expression changed. "Why would you ask that?" "Because you didn't answer." Rebecca finally admitted. "The realtor stopped by." Margaret's stomach tightened. "The realtor? Just to look at the property. Who invited him?" Rebecca didn't answer, and Margaret already knew. That afternoon, Margaret called her longtime neighbor. "Mrs. Collins," she kept her voice calm. "Have you noticed anything unusual around my house?" Mrs. Collins hesitated before answering. "Margaret, I didn't know whether I should tell you." "Tell me," her neighbor explained that 2 men had been coming around the property. One carried a camera, while another measured the rooms. Margaret closed her eyes. "Did my children let them in?" "I think so." Margaret's fingers tightened around the phone. Her children hadn't simply moved her into a nursing home. They were preparing to sell her house. Then Mrs. Collins added something that made Margaret's heart pound. "They told me the house is going on the market next week." Margaret sat completely still. Next week. They had already made a plan. Then she remembered something Robert had told her 6 months before he died. He had taken her into his study, looked directly into her eyes, and said, "If anything ever happens to me, don't let anyone pressure you into selling this house." At the time, Margaret had laughed and asked why he was being so serious. Robert hadn't laughed. "Promise me." She had. Now Margaret knew exactly where she needed to look. Hidden inside, Robert's study was something her children had never known existed. That evening, Margaret asked Mrs. Collins to do something she hadn't asked anyone to do in years. "Go into Robert's study," she said quietly. "Behind the second shelf of the bookcase, there should be a small wooden box." Mrs. Collins found it within minutes. "There's a key inside," she said. "Check the bottom drawer of Robert's desk," Margaret replied. "Behind the old stationery." A moment later, Mrs. Collins found the key and opened the box. Inside was a thick folder, a sealed envelope, and several documents bearing Robert's signature. "Margaret, what is all this?" she asked. "I don't know," Margaret said, although part of her remembered that Robert had always been strangely protective of those papers. "Open the envelope." Mrs. Collins hesitated. "Are you sure?" "Yes." She photographed the first page and sent it to Margaret. Margaret opened the image on her phone and immediately recognized the name at the top. Thomas Bennett, Robert's longtime estate attorney. Then she read the first paragraph. The house had been transferred into something called the Hayes Family Trust. Margaret's name appeared as the primary beneficiary. She read it again, trying to understand why Robert had never told her about it. Then she remembered the night he'd given her the key. 6 months before his death, Robert had taken her into his study and said, "If anything happens to me, don't let anyone pressure you into selling this house." She had laughed and asked why he was being so serious. Robert had simply looked at her and said, "Promise me." She had promised. Now Margaret asked Mrs. Collins to photograph the next document. It contained a clause that made her sit completely still. The house could not be sold, transferred, or mortgaged without Margaret's written authorization. Daniel and Rebecca had no authority over it simply because they had placed her in a nursing home. But there was something even more disturbing. Robert had added a provision protecting Margaret from anyone who tried to interfere with her control of the property. Margaret stared at the screen, her hands trembling slightly. Her children hadn't just made a foolish assumption. They had been preparing to sell something they didn't own. Then her phone rang. It was Daniel. "Mom, how are you settling in?" Margaret looked at Robert's documents and answered calmly, "I'm fine." Daniel sounded relieved. "Good, because Rebecca and I have already started handling the house." Margaret paused. "Handling it how?" Daniel hesitated before saying, "We've found a buyer." Margaret's eyes narrowed. They already had a buyer, and suddenly she realized this was much bigger than she had imagined. Margaret asked Daniel how much the buyer was offering, and when he told her the number, she finally understood why her children had been so eager to get her out of the house. It wasn't just a home to them anymore. It was a fortune. "That sounds like a good offer," Margaret said calmly. Daniel immediately relaxed. "It is. We can finally take care of everything." Margaret almost smiled at the word "we." "And what happens to me?" she asked. Daniel paused. "You'll be taken care of. Mom, the nursing home is expensive, but once the house sells, we'll have enough." Margaret looked down at Robert's documents. They weren't talking about protecting her future. They were already spending the money from a house they didn't own. "All right," she said. "Go ahead." Daniel went silent. "Really?" "Yes, sell the house." He sounded almost relieved. "Thank you, Mom. You won't regret it." After the call ended, Margaret immediately contacted Thomas Bennett, Robert's attorney. She explained everything. Thomas listened without interrupting, then asked one question. "Did you sign anything?" "No." "Then they cannot complete the sale?" Margaret asked what would happen if Daniel and Rebecca continued. Thomas explained that the trust specifically protected her authority over the property, and any unauthorized attempt to transfer it would create serious legal consequences. But Margaret didn't want to simply stop them immediately. She wanted them to understand exactly what they had done. "Let them continue," she said. "I want to see how far they'll go." 2 days later, Daniel and Rebecca arrived at the house with the realtor. They walked through the rooms discussing the sale as if Margaret's life had already been divided between them. Rebecca pointed at Robert's piano and said she wanted it. Daniel was already calculating how much money each of them would receive. Neither noticed the black sedan parked across the street. Inside sat Thomas Bennett. He had brought the original trust documents and one additional file Margaret had asked him to prepare. When Daniel opened the front door, Thomas stepped onto the porch and said, Daniel Hayes? Daniel turned. Yes? Thomas held up his identification. My name is Thomas Bennett. I was your father's attorney. Daniel's smile disappeared. Daniel stared at Thomas Bennett. Why are you here? Thomas calmly stepped inside and placed the original trust documents on the dining table. Because you are attempting to sell a property controlled by the Hayes family trust, without the authority required by the trust. Rebecca immediately stepped forward. Mom agreed to the sale. Thomas looked at her. Your mother has not signed anything. Daniel's face tightened. She told us to sell it. She told you that, Thomas replied. But she did not authorize a transfer of the property. He opened the trust and pointed to a specific clause. Your father made Margaret the controlling beneficiary. No sale can proceed without her written authorization, and there are consequences for anyone who attempts to interfere with her rights. Daniel read the document and went pale. Rebecca grabbed the pages from his hand. This can't be right, Thomas replied. It is exactly what your father intended. Then the front door opened. Margaret walked inside. Daniel froze. Mom? She looked at both of her children. You put me in a nursing home so you could sell my house. Rebecca immediately started crying. That isn't what happened. Margaret pointed toward the realtor. Then why did you already have a buyer? Why had you photographed the rooms? Why were you discussing how much money you'd each receive? Neither answered. Margaret walked slowly toward Robert's old chair and rested her hand on it. For 2 years, I believed you were taking care of me because you loved me. She looked at Daniel. But you weren't protecting me. You were waiting for me to become powerless. Then she turned toward Rebecca. And you helped him. Daniel tried to apologize, but Margaret raised her hand. Don't. I don't want excuses. Thomas explained that the sale was terminated and that neither child had any authority over the property. Margaret then told them she would be changing her estate plan. Whatever Robert had intended to leave them would no longer be guaranteed after what they had done. Daniel stared at her. Mom, please. Margaret shook her head. You didn't lose this house because of a legal technicality. You lost my trust when you decided my home was worth more than I was. She asked them to leave, and for once neither argued. Later that evening, Margaret sat alone on the front porch with Robert's photograph beside her. The house was quiet again. She looked at the keys in her hand and finally understood why Robert had protected the home so carefully. It wasn't about money. It was about making sure she always had somewhere that belonged to her. Margaret hadn't lost her family when she stood up to them. She had lost them the moment they decided her life was worth less than the house. They wanted to sell.